Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome to the second video of this multiple part series where I show you how I built that neat scan effect in Unreal Engine. In the previous video I showed you how to set up inputs, create all the blueprints required for this effect and set up the material parameter collection, so it's all ready to go. Just have to actually build that post-process material now, which is the topic of today's video. Now, quick disclaimer, this is quite an advanced effect and this tutorial might not be super beginner friendly. I'll try my best to do things one step at a time and explain things to the best of my abilities. That being said, to keep the video somewhat short, I will also not create everything from scratch, but take a sort of breakdown approach like I usually do. It takes way too long to recreate everything from scratch with a step-by-step approach, and I'm not sure it'd be more valuable anyway. We still have a long journey ahead though, so let's not waste any time and get right into it. Alright, let's start simple and add more and more complexity as we go. First order of business is to create what I call the blink effect. This sort of expanding distortion effect. And actually, I'm going to use plenty of that kind of radial expansion effects in this post-process material, both in 2D and 3D, so let's create a material function. I'm going to get the distance between the absolute world position and a given position in world space called origin. Subtract that distance by a radius in centimeters, divide by a thickness in centimeters as well, saturate on 1-, and that's the inner mask. Now that thickness parameter makes that circle grow, and I'd like it not to, so I'm going to subtract that thickness from the radius. Then I'm going to subtract this by that thickness once more, divide again by it, and saturate, and that's the outer mask. Finally, multiply this saturate with that 1-, and I have a sort of donut shape that expands from its center line based on this thickness parameter. Yay! Now let's add a few extra controls, like an offset to that radius, also the ability to set a thickness multiplier, right away set to 2, which will be handy later on. Then let's multiply that radius by a time value so it can be made to grow and shrink. To conclude with this material function, that radius input pin is by default going to be that range set in this material parameter collection, and I'm actually going to rename it to range. Time is going to be the normalized time, thickness the cell grid size, and origin the scan location. Now here's a trick I'm going to use again and again in this post-process material. This function for now uses the absolute world position to compute this spherical gradient, right? Well, let's mess with that position, like say divide by 20, round, and multiply by 20. That kinda creates voxels of 20 centimeters cubed, and it creates that blocky looking expanding ring effect. Which already sort of looks similar to what I have in the final effect, right? It's clearly grid based. Now let me clean this real quick and get rid of that voxelization trick example. Alright, now that I have this material function, let's use it to create that screen distortion effect. Use texture coordinate 0, use that same rendering trick to create cells, then a bias scale to center UVs. And because that function expects a 3D vector, let's convert that 2D vector to 3D with a z component of 0. And origin is 0, 0, but again this function expects a 3D vector, so 0, 0, 0. Let's add time as well. Then I'm going to normalize this 2D vector. This gives me a direction away from the center of the screen, right? And that direction, multiplied by this expanding radial mask, gives me a 2D offset I can add to texture coordinates to distort them. See? Now let me tidy up this material function real quick and add an extra output node as well to, well, output that UV offset. Next step, I need to ensure that this radial effect actually starts from a null radius and ends past the corner of the screen, if that makes sense. So I first need to add a bit of radius offset based on twice the thickness, and also tweak the range in various ways based on the square root of 2 to increase it, so it doesn't reach the edge here, but that corner here. So I need to multiply that radius by some amount based on that thickness and whatnot, math, you know. And I also need to replace that time by an input pin, and its default value is going to be that normalized time once more. Alright, let's play around with those settings and make sure everything is working properly. And that cell grid size does indeed create, well, a grid effect. Cool, then I can actually tweak the amount of distortion to add inside and outside that donut shape, based on that inner mask. So I'm just going to expose some settings for that inner and outer distortion. And maybe add a control for the fall off as well. Alright, let's clean this mess. Again, I'm I'm just going to try a few different settings and make sure everything works. Alright, looks good to me. I also created a curve linear color with a curve in the red channel to remap that normalized time to a more snappy and faster blend, right? Just have to add this curve linear color asset to an atlas curve like so. And then you get access to it in materials via a curve atlas row parameter node. And this setup gives me this effect, okay? Then I'm going to lerp this with a black color using the inner mask for the alpha value. Cool, instead of lerping to a black color though, let's sample this post-process input again, make sure it's distorted as well, and apply some basic color treatment. A simple desaturation and a multiply with a color will do the trick. Alright, fast forward a bit, I actually haven't changed anything, just made the graph much cleaner using named reroutes. Taking it a tiny step further, I can also add a super cheap flash effect. It's just a color added to the overall image only for a brief moment, using the blue channel in that linear color curve asset. I can also add a cheap overlay color on top of that post-process input. Super simple. Both these two effects are made to be quite subtle, they don't do a lot, but they add a tiny bit to the effect. Alright, moving on, I'd like for that post-process image to be revealed progressively all around me in 3D space. So I first would like for this blink effect to show a plain background color and only then the world is scanned and revealed on top of it, if that makes sense. So add a second lerp to interpolate between a background color and the scanned image. Alpha is going to be that normalized time for now, just to see what we are dealing with. And actually, let's replace these other time placeholder nodes with this normalized time parameter as well. Okay, let's try it out. That blink effect happens, and then the world is gradually lerped from a plain color to its final image. Let's change that lerp alpha to something more interesting, like an expanding radial mask, you might suggest? Well, yes, exactly. I'm going to use that function again. And just like I showed you earlier, I'm going to make use of that world space coordinates voxelization trick, okay? But actually, I'm going to use that trick so often that I might as well create a material function for it, like so. And with that lerp set up like this, and actually let's use a decent color from now on, I get this effect. Which is kinda cool, but certainly lacks some oomph, and possibly some randomness as well. So first I'm going to make use of a curve, again, to remap that normalized time, to maybe delay it a bit and make it way more snappy. Cool. Now about randomness, well, there are many solutions. For instance, there's this vector noise node, which has a super cheap grid cell function. Give it this grid position and it outputs this kind of result. And I'm going to blend that with a remap time using an overlay mode, kinda like layers in Photoshop, right? UE actually has a built-in function for this called blend overlay. It's meant to be used with an RGB vector though, so I just got rid of that green and blue channel logic to end up with that small node graph. And that's a blend overlay for just one channel. Why an overlay effect though? Well, I still want that time to be 0 when it's 0 and 1 when it's 1. I just want some noise when it's between 0 and 1, right? An overlay does precisely that. Let's try it out then. Cool, it's however quite random and I might want to tune it down a bit. Well, just use a lerp between the non-randomized and randomized time and that's it. Noise, so I'm just going to replace this bit here with that lerp. Next, I might want to exclude my pawn from the scan effect, and again there are many solutions. Most people, I think, are not aware of that stencil test feature that is built in post-process materials. Assuming that you have the stencil buffer enabled in your project settings, and that you set a stencil index on your character mesh or whatever mesh you want, you can specify this post-process material to not be applied onto whatever mesh has that stencil index. Kinda cool. I could also do that using custom logic for any reason. This tiny material function here just allows me to specify my pawn mesh stencil ID in one place. In case I need to change it, I can do that just once here. Then I have this material function that samples the stencil buffer and compares it with a given index to output a black and white mask. Black and white mask used to drive a lerp so that post-process effect is applied anywhere but on that stencil ID. Be aware that this kind of trick will produce aliasing if the post-process material is rendered after tone mapping, because it's then essentially rendered after anti-aliasing. Speaking of stencil, I'm also going to add a cheap character outline with the most simple and common method to do so. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I have this function that creates 5 black and white masks by comparing the stencil buffer with a given index, well, 5 times. Once quote-unquote in place at the processed pixel, and 4 more times. Once offset in positive x by 1 pixel by default, but also once offset in negative x, positive y, and negative y. And then I just compare the average neighboring value with the value in place, and that gives me this character outline, which is simply lerped with the scan image. Speaking of outlines, let's push the scan effect to the next level. One other very common method to draw outlines is to rely on the normal buffer to do the same kind of convolution kernel. Here I have a function that really just compares the world normal at a pixel with the average world normal at 4 surrounding pixels, which creates this kind of effect. It's again simply lerped using a plain color with the scan image. Sweet, it lacks some oomph though. I'd want a much brighter color when the scan expands right at that expansion edge. So I'm going to use yet another expansion ring function and feed it that grid unit position once more as well. Time is going to be a mix between that expand alpha and expand alpha randomized, so I can choose between the two. Thickness will have to be multiplied by some amount so that the effect takes place on multiple grid cells at once. And I might choose to fade out that boost value over time as well by multiplying this donut mask with the inverse of that lerp. Here I chose to have an almost entirely faded out expansion boost so that I do still have some kind of quote-unquote boost at that edge when the scan effect has fully expanded out and I move around. Right, that alone creates this donut shape that expands in 3D space and that almost entirely fades out. It's voxelized because of that grid unit position, and it takes place over many cells because of that thickness multiplier to expand that quote-unquote donut gradient. Just to be sure I'm talking about that thing, right? Picture this in 3D space expanding from the pawn. And I'm going to use this as a mask to lerp between that outline color and a much brighter one, like so. Alright, we are making good progress. I'm going to add a cheap Fresnel effect to that scan image just by using the world normal buffer, a dot product with a camera vector, and a fall-off control. Very simple, right? It's just multiplied by a color and added as is to the scan image. Now here's a nice trick you can use. You can create a sort of faceted look with that Fresnel effect by using that same rounding trick, but here it's done to snap that normal vector to a specific grid direction, if that makes sense. And this gives this kind of result, which you might or might not like. Noise. Now I'm going to quote-unquote boost that Fresnel effect, just like I did with the outline. So same principle, lerp with a much brighter Fresnel color when the scan is expanding, right at that expansion edge, and voila! One effect I also added is a subtle pulse effect emanating from the pawn. So once again I'm going to use that function. Time is however going to be, well, the actual time for once, made to loop every second with a simple frac node. And why not add a control for that expanding donut mask fall-off? Then I'm simply going to add that mask to further boost that outline and Fresnel opacity, which gives this subtle smooth pulse effect. Moreover, I can create a grid effect by once again feeding that function a grid position instead of the absolute world position, and voila! That pulse effect is applied to entire grid cells. We are slowly getting there. Continuing to add complexity to this post-processed material, let's create a grid effect. This is once again a math-driven effect, but it's not crazy complicated. I'm going to use the absolute world position and start simple with a one-dimensional grid. Divide by the grid cell size, add a potential offset in grid unit, frac to get the fractional part of that position, which creates a looping 0 to 1 position, and subtract by 0.5 absolute and multiply by 2 to create a bilinear gradient. Then multiply by some amount and saturate, and that kinda sharpens that gradient and creates lines. Cool, now get rid of that component mask. That offset is then in 3D space. And then I just have to combine that 3D gradient to create lines using component masks to get that red, green and blue gradient individually and multiply them together. And then one minus, and voila! Now that technique doesn't work great with slopes, as you can see, so that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, that bit here is actually what I added to this grid function there, right? And that grid is colorized and added as is on top of the scan image. However, I used a neat trick. That grid cell size is divided by power of 2s when the scan effect expands. So it goes from 1 to 0, so actually from 6 to 0, and so that divides this grid cell size by 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, you get the idea. And that subdivides this grid upon starting the scan. And because that thickness is kept constant, when the grid is subdivided enough, well, you only see white lines basically, which is something you might or might not want. Almost there. This effect is really similar to the world grid, but it's basically inverted and shrunk to create what I called dots. The idea is almost identical. Get that bilinear 3D gradient, offset it, throw it, and combine individual channels to create a black and white pattern. And then I chose to boost that effect the same way I did for the outline and Fresnel. So with that pulse value and boost mask at that expansion edge to drive both those dots size and brightness. Last effect, and to me the star of the show, that texture Upres effect. And it's actually not that complicated. It involves a bit of HLSL code, but it's not that bad. Essentially, this effect works by manipulating the texture coordinates used to map this scene texture node. By default, that texture coordinate looks like this, right? And with this trick, it looks like this. It's in slow-mo here, so you can see what's going on. Alright, so I first get the absolute world position and use that voxelized trick, right? And then, using just 3 lines of HLSL, I convert that voxelized world position back to UVs using a matrix multiplication and perspective deprojection. And that's pretty much it. Now this comes with a few caveats. This absolute world position is actually reconstructed from the depth buffer. The thing is, with temporal anti-aliasing, this depth buffer jitters just a tiny bit. It's how temporal AA works, right? It moves the camera just a tiny bit every frame and accumulates the result over time. So that absolute world position is actually a tiny bit jittery, which is normally not a problem. However, this voxelized trick makes it quite apparent. I tried to find workarounds, besides disabling TAA obviously. One thing I tried was to account for that temporal jitter, but I couldn't find a solution. I tried reconstructing the world position from the depth buffer myself, but shifting that depth buffer UVs by that temporal offset, but it just made it more jittery. It produced cool visuals though, but not what I wanted. Anyway, one extra thing I added to this effect is that up resolution effect, which is once again simply done by subdividing this grid cell size over time to eventually reach a subdivision close enough to the final resolution, and at that point I actually switched to the actual texture coordinates to get rid of the jitter in the fully expanded scan image. And you know what? That's it. Sure, everything added together it's a lot, right? But when you look at it piece by piece, it's not that bad, now is it? It's like you have this big problem to solve, and so you split it in smaller, much more manageable problems and build complexity one step at a time, and you eventually get there. Just make sure to keep your graph clean, name your variables, group them, add comments and switches so you know what part of the graph does what, use material functions to reuse code, and named reroutes to avoid spaghetti mess. And yeah, really just don't let yourself get overwhelmed by the complexity of what you're trying to build, and do things one step at a time. Alright, let's talk performance now. Well, on the CPU it's pretty much negligible. This component is extremely simple and doesn't do much on tick, and convert it to C++ and then its cost would be pretty much null. On the GPU it's also actually quite decent. At 1080p, this post-process material costs under 0.1 millisecond to render on a 4070, so it's definitely nothing crazy. And because this is all set up properly, you only pay the cost of that post-process material when it's actually active. When that post-process wait reaches 0, it's disabled and this material is entirely skipped. So all in all, I'd say this is not only a cool looking effect, but quite a performant one as well. And that's it for today's video, I hope you liked it. The journey isn't over yet though, there's still room for improvements. And so in the next and final video, I'll show you how I built this cool grid effect using a Niagara particle system. It packs a few neat tricks as well, so stay tuned. That video is already available on my Patreon in early access, so feel free to check it out. It's a way for you to support me and you get access to a long list of cool UI projects and demos. Any support is much appreciated. Speaking of which, thanks to all my patrons for the amazing support. Thanks so much. Also, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you liked the video. Alright, I'll see you in the next video. Take care of yourself. Bye bye!